How's it going, everyone? My name is Graham, the man behind Two Left Thumbs, and I'm here today with solo developer Oliver Joyce to talk about his upcoming game, Gorgon Shield.
Welcome to Gorgon Shield.
That's been in development for a little over a year now, whereas Two Left Thumbs came in about 9 months ago as publisher. And later down the line, we were joined by Gamersky to help cover the Chinese market. I thought it would be interesting to sit down with Oliver, talk about how he first came up with this idea, and how that all led to the eventual release we have coming up. July 29th, it'll launch for just $8.99. There will be 10% off as an initial launch discount there, so be sure to go give it a wish list. We'll have links down below, go check that out. I hope everything's been going well. We're in the home stretch here.
I know, man, yeah, like, it's been a bit of a crazy year, so I have to apologize for sort of like, it all being kind of bit of a... It was everything was going well, and then so we had the health stuff and everything, and it really kind of hit my focus pretty hard, and I had to sort of get back and get this thing finished off. So definitely it's been a challenging since kind of March or April, but I'm happy with how it's turned out, even though it's definitely without a lie, it's definitely been one of the hardest games I've had to build, and not just from not really from a technical perspective, just from a focus perspective.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. I think a lot of development is just a series of shifting prioritizations, and I think you had to deal with that more than usual. Yeah.
But by the same token, game dev can be a really good kind of respite from the problems of the real world sometimes. Anytime you have a really, a hobby or a pastime that you're really into, I find it can really just sort of just take your focus and allow you to sort of not think about the problems of, everything else for a little while, and channel everything into what you're doing. So once I kind of basically all through March, I was like, I can't do anything. But then by the time April came, I was like, all right, we're ready to go again. And I had this sort of, renewed vigor to get it all done and dusted.
Yeah, you definitely. I feel like there was a real blitz of updates there where you really took it from the state the game was in to release ready in no time. It was pretty crazy, the blitz you went through there.
Well, and I think that the real catalyst was the SD, the game doctor, and I think watching him play the game just made me realize what I'd kind of done wrong, and what and there were just some obvious things and some not so obvious things, but that was oh, okay, yeah, this, there's a few things here that can really change up how the game works. And then that was the real sort of wake up moment where it's oh, you think you know your game so well, but you know it too well, and then you're not realizing the obvious problems that new players are going to have with it.
This conversation is going to wander a lot. At first, I was planning to do a series of questions, and I was like, well, now I'd rather just pick at the threads of as they come up. And so I'm a little bit curious if maybe there was a singular thing or more broad strokes after seeing SD play the game where you were like, oh, obviously these are the weak points or what have you.
Yeah, now I'm trying to remember exactly what his feedback was, except that I remember that it was it was a real lightning bulb moment. There was a few things where it just felt like there was too much going on at all times, and I think you might have suggested around the same time that hey, let's have these heroes sort of come on board during the level. So you start off with the one, and then when you get to level 4, second hero jumps on, third hero jumps on. So the onboarding process, it was mainly the onboarding process, I think, that was really improved by your suggestions and his suggestions. And I think it was also that there was just too much going on at all times. And so I basically decided to sort of, scale it back a bit and just sort of reveal things to players just a little more slowly, just in terms of the levels and, when you're introducing new skills and new mechanisms and so on, because I was just watching the SD play, and there was a bunch of things that felt obvious to me, but he hadn't picked up on, and I was like, well, I've sort of introduced this all way too quickly, so he hasn't even had a chance to sort of pick up on that.
That's funny that I feel I may have got pulled into the similar circle because we're going back and forth, sharing new builds and things, and same as yourself, I grew kind of close to it, gain a familiarity, and you get some blind spots to like, this is a complicated game, even though you get really used to the micromanagement of shifting your shield and everything. It's like there's quite a lot to it.
Yeah, and what I find the really hard thing about modern game dev versus maybe doing it a long time ago is that how quick you have to engage players and pull them in, and basically there's not a lot of room for hey, if you play this 5 or 10 times, you'll figure out the mechanics and then it'll all make sense. People sort of go, look, if I haven't figured this out in the first 5 minutes, I'm probably out on it. And so you have to sort of have this balance of like, depth to come, but also making it instantly accessible. So there's this kind of weighing up, like, do I make this easier or harder, or do I bombard them with stuff to show there's all this depth, or do I sort of keep it simple but then still make it feel like, hey, there's more to the game than just this.
The fact that players bounce off games rather quickly and they aren't necessarily, there's, what was the number I saw the other day? It's like 14,000 games released on Steam a year or something. It's like,
and it's going up and up and up every year.
Yeah.
Exponentially.
So do you find that is detrimental to your development process to know that you only have a limited one sit down with a game to make someone engage with it?
Absolutely. And it was really kind of tough to sort of like build that in because I'm used to building these games that sort of have, lots of layers and lots of sort of depth and so on. And this was, to be fair, like always designed to be sort of like an arcade game that you can pick up and play and so on. But because I like sort of role-playing games, I always throw all these RPG elements, but sometimes they get too complicated, and sometimes it's at odds with what the player wants straight away. When this game was first in development, it was right sort of at one of the peaks of the Vampire Survivors rush, and it was probably a good 6 months or so after Vampire Survivors had reached its peak, but it was still high. And I had that in mind when I was building it, with the quick level ups and so on, and the sort of dopamine hits. But it definitely made things way too frantic. So I was trying to go, trying to get all this depth in one direction, but also simplicity in another. And it took a long time to figure out what exactly this game was, And that's often one of the problems with game dev, is that you have to, you can just do as much paper design as you want, but you have to spend months and months actually sort of building something before you know what you've got. And often it's nearly too late by that time. It's like, okay, what have we built? Is this something people actually want?
Yeah. You mentioned like when the game was gearing up in development around the Vampire Survivors popularity, but I wonder if it would be interesting to take the step further back to kind of talk about how things started with Everyone Gets Treasure, and how that, like, so much of the DNA carried over from that, but it ended up in such a different place.
Totally. And that game came about it's almost 10 years ago now, and I was on holidays with my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, and I was sitting on a hill in a valley in a beautiful location, and she was reading a book, and I was just sort of sketching in on my little game notepad, because even when you're on holidays, still the mind is ticking.
Yeah, you don't want to waste a good idea.
Yeah. And this idea came to me of this platform where you have heroes and so on, because I kind of, my philosophy with the Flash era of games was always like trying to recreate the games that I loved, but in like sort of bite-sized pieces. Like if I could take the 2 or 3 best things from any game that I liked, growing up, and then put them into a blender and just make a little snack-sized version, what would I make? And this was sort of like my attempt at like a dungeon crawler party role-playing game, but without all the sort of moving around and everything just comes to you. And with Everyone Gets Treasure, I sort of had this idea of making it a game show, almost like The Running Man, if you remember the Arnie movies.
Yeah. A King novel, I think.
Yeah, that's right. The Stephen King book. Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And the idea was that the characters would be on stage and they'd run in, and the crowd would be behind them cheering as they did things. At that time, it was turn-based because I still had sort of it just made more sense to me because I was just good at turn-based stuff, and everything I'd ever done was turn-based. And the idea of doing it in real time only came about because of things like Vampire Survivors and the kind of the rush of like quick 5 minute games and so on. With a turn-based game, even a quick game goes for quite a long time because you're sitting there thinking about your moves. If you have four characters on a shield, even any one, one turn might go for a minute and that kind of thing. And I wanted a much faster experience.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense of why you would chase a more active gameplay loop. What are some things that you had as a part of the turn-based that, other than just mechanically, that you were like, well, this will never translate to an active format?
Yeah, there was the original one had 5 characters and one in the middle that couldn't do anything, and that was sort of ended up being replaced by the shield itself. It has to take the damage. But the idea was that you could characters could swap out weapons and armor, and they had sort of access to various spells that you'd have a little circular wheel of items, much like Swords and Sandals. And then you take your time and go, this character's going to defend, and this character's going to do this, and then the monster would have a turn. And none of that made it into Gorgon Shield. It was all replaced by this character has one skill. Because the problem with 4 players in a game is that you quickly run out of buttons. And if you're designing it for a keyboard, we were trying to work out how to even get 2 skills in, and it just ended up being too much, right?
Right, I do remember that. Yeah, that I think had to get cut almost immediately because there was just no physical way to make that work.
Yeah, and one thing I think you and I played it a lot, and so you get really good at sort of doing the mechanics automatically. But even sometimes watching you play, and then when I played it even yesterday to do the Steam broadcast video, I was forgetting to use the shield laser and so on because I hadn't played it in a few weeks, and then I'm thinking, oh yeah, the players have skills and so on. So you just forget a lot of the things that are in the game, and it's really hard to sort of telegraph, hey, you can use this, you can use this, you can use this. And in a turn-based game, that's much less of a problem because a player can sit there and think, oh, what I want to do. There's no sort of danger of being attacked the whole time.
Yeah, you can get what's the Darkest Dungeon? 4 heroes and they all have like 4 skills. You have so much opportunity there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that game was, in many ways an influence in terms of like the party banter and the sort of the combinations of characters and so on. And I always wanted to make a game like Darkest Dungeons, and originally I was hoping to turn like a Swords and Sandals into that, and it never ended up happening. But I definitely was inspired in part by some things by Darkest Dungeons. But Darkest Dungeons suits turn-based perfectly, and it has that little real-time movement between levels that also influenced Gorgon Shield in a little way in terms of like, I like the idea of having various sort of phases of the game. You have the labyrinth and the snakes and ladders and the shops and so on. Originally, when I talked to you early on, my idea was to have a bunch of sort of mini game phases.
Right, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, but then I remember reading somewhere, and I've read this many times, that it's sort of like, if you can't do this thing really well, and to the level you're hoping to do it, maybe leave it out. So it's sort of like it was going to be how well is sort of the platforming element going to be in this game, and how mini game-esque is that going to feel? Is this taking the focus away from the main sort of the tower climb section, that kind of thing? Because my main fear with the game was always like, is this too simple? Is this too simple? Because I was thinking, I've played it so much, a player's going to find this too simple. But everyone that played it found the opposite, said it's complicated and it's challenging and so on. So that made me realize, hey, you can probably cut out most of the mini games. I kept the labyrinth in there because it did feel like a nice break in pace from the main section, and it was a bit of a tribute to games like Gauntlet and that kind of thing from the arcade.
And Gauntlet's probably the one that I most directly see in Gorgon Shield. Maybe you would argue there's other games that were a greater influence. That is the big one. Hey.
Yeah, fully. Grew up playing it, and it was one of those things I always wanted to make my own. So I kind of shoehorned it into the game a little, I must admit, but it does at least thematically feel right.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting to me that even back at the time of Everyone Gets Treasure, which I guess I should ask now, was it going to be a Flash game at that point in time?
It was going to be. It was built in Flash, but it was going to be a Steam game.
Oh yeah.
It was past the. This was around. It was past the time of like the Steve Jobs, the death of Flash, the infamous letter and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'd sort of pivoted. It was the first game that I'd made since I left the old company making Swords and Sandals games and so on. And so I wanted to build a game on Steam and everything. And that was my sort of, first shot at it. It was built in Flash, but using this framework called Starling, which I don't know if you're familiar with. But
Brad uses it a lot for Fancy Pants.
Yeah, and it's perfect for games like Fancy Pants because it just moves sprites along really fast, and it's basically graphics accelerated Flash, which the original Flash never had that. And so Flash was really cool with vectors and so on, but it would struggle with large bitmaps moving around, everything like that. But Starling sort of solved that problem, and this was built in that. But I got about sort of maybe a couple of months into development, and then the artist I was working with sort of got bored of it, and then I can't remember what happened, but I pivoted completely, and I never came back to it until 9 years later. But it was always intended to be a Steam game, and I kind of wish in some ways that I had persisted with it in 2013 or 2014 because there was a lot less competition back then on Steam.
It's interesting to me. There's that aspect of it, but also so many of the indie games whose DNA have made their way into Gorgon Shield, the advent of the roguelike revolution and all those things, like none of that would have found its way into the game. It would have looked so different.
It's very different. It's crazy. I always look at these games like Vampire Survivors and Balatro and all these things and think, what a great idea. I should have thought of that. But then I've been doing this for a long time and I never did think of that. And these things always come to you way too late,
Yeah.
So I never I never thought about doing roguelike stuff in 2013, 2014, that kind of stuff. It sort of was always sort of like following traditional path of, what is the trend at the time and so on. And I was always still trying to emulate the games that I liked growing up. But some of the game devs that really, they make millions and millions and millions, it's just this genius idea of like, putting a roguelike, but then, making it sort of a bite-sized chunk of a roguelike, and then adding the sort of dopamine hits of like a poker machine and that kind of stuff. And you think, wow, of course, it all makes sense, but I didn't think of it.
I do think it's really important that at least a pretty sizable chunk of your inspiration or what motivates game development is rooted in the things you like. Like if you were to wake up tomorrow and you're like, I'm going to make a flight simulator for whatever, they're really popular. One that they sold really well last year. And it's just like, well, if that's not what you played, there's nothing to pull from.
Yeah.
Like, it needs to have that degree of, I'm sure it informs a lot of design decisions, but also just keeps you motivated, I imagine. And
it really does. And I would always kind of just really stress to younger game devs that are getting in, like, don't chase trends, that kind of stuff. And it is always tempting to, but your heart has to be in it. Like if all of a sudden flight simulators are really popular and then you want to make your flight simulator, but you never had played any, never had any interest in it and so on, your heart's not going to be in it, and it's going to show. You know what I mean? You can take elements from a flight simulator and then say if you were really into like sailing on someone, you could do it. Flying ships or something like that. But you have to thematically be into it, and that's so mechanically, but you definitely have to be into the theme of it, because you see so many, especially in mobile game market, is very much, it's all analytics based and trends based and so on. And it's all that, and there's very little heart in a lot of those games. But on Steam and PC games and so on, you still see, for the most part, developers making games that they tend to be passionate about.
Do you think there's anything in your catalog, even going back to the Flash days, where it was more chasing what was popular at the time, and you just feel it never came together?
Oh yeah, it's crazy. There was probably the first example of the Swords and Sandals games. I'd made the first three, and I was, really kind of on a roll with them, and they were starting to get bigger and more complicated. And then my boss at the time had this idea of like, a bunch of us have been making all these Flash games, and he said, what about you turn Swords and Sandals 4 into like a collection of mini games, and we're going to reskin all those old mini games and put them together because we're going to chase the really casual game market. Because at that time, games like Peggle and Bejeweled and all that kind of stuff were really popular. This is really showing my age now. So,
well, I was playing some of the same, yeah.
and they were. So it's like let's make our own little version of Bejeweled and everything, and then chuck them in Swords and Sandals. And make it a board game, kind of like a Mario Party sort of thing. And this was just this nuts idea. And I'd already started on like a dungeon crawler, and I had to sort of get the engine and just chuck all these mini games in. And I knew that we were just chasing this casual games market that were never going to be interested in gladiators and trying to mash it all together. The game came out, it didn't sell very well, but weirdly enough, many years later, a lot of people, well, not a lot. There's a chunk of people out there that still kind of go, oh yeah, that's one of my favorites because it is so different, and I do love playing these mini games. So it did work. But all through the years, I've built, certainly in the Flash era, non-Swords and Sandals games, not always of my own sort of volition, but under orders and so on, built games that have tried to chase the trends, and they've failed. Everything from like racing games to 3-in-a-row puzzle games to word searches and everything, and you can just tell because my heart wasn't in it, and they'd go up, and your main chance of or your main barometer for success was putting it up on something like Newgrounds and then just seeing how well it did. And the games that you kind of knew weren't going to do that well because your heart wasn't in it, they didn't do well. They disappeared. They got the 1 star, 2 stars and everything, and within a day they were kind of just dead.
It is funny that is it Tavern Quests? That's the fourth one, right?
That's the one.
It's funny that there was still the necessity of forcing it into a Swords and Sandals box, that someone didn't just think Tavern Quests as a new IP, a standalone thing that is minigame focused, could have got some footing. It's kind of funny the way it's jammed in the middle of the Swords and Sandals franchise, but I'm just curious if, because that was such a format break, even if it didn't go well, was that motivational to be like, well, Swords and Sandals can be whatever I want?
In some ways it did, and it kind of set the whole franchise from there onwards, because every game since has been different, and for better or worse. And like I've talked to a lot of people about this, and and just in general how like game dev, and you would probably agree with this as a publisher. There's a term, something to do with bananas or something like that. Like you sort of have green bananas and yellow bananas. It's all about you basically, as long as a few of the things you invest in or that you build do well, it can kind of cover the ones that don't do so well. You just need to sort of, be savvy enough to be able, because if you make 10 games, chances are 8 of them might not do that well, and maybe even more, And so with Swords and Sandals, there was, after the Tavern Quest, there was a dungeon crawler, then there was a pirate theme one, there was another sort of army based one. The one that I think did the worst, the least popular game I've ever made, I made it in Unity about 4 years ago. It's called Spartacus, and this was a pixel art platform game. And when I started, there was still a fair few platform games out there, but by the time I finished, they were everywhere. and it thematically was just based on the legend of the gladiator Spartacus and so on. This wasn't a game that I wanted to build or had sort of chosen to build, but E-Games, who my publisher at for Sword and Sandals, had really wanted to sort of tell the story of Spartacus, and so we sort of worked out, well, this could be a fun way to do it. But we kind of went backwards and forwards on should we throw the Sword and Sandals name onto it or not. It was a really tenuous link between sort of gladiators and Sword and Sandals, and in the end, it didn't actually help because people that like Sword and Sandals hadn't come to play a platform game, and people that like platform games weren't necessarily interested in Swords and Sandals. And so the game did very poorly, and partly it was my own fault because I had some bugs in the game that I could never fix. The player would fall through the floor and stuff like that, and I was like, oh no. Right. But it was a really good lesson, and you can only push variety so far. You can only pirates, crusaders, dungeon crawls, all thematically still feel part of a Sword and Sandals universe, but a side-scrolling platform game is just one bridge too far.
Right. Yeah, I could see how maybe if there was more of a stepping stone towards that, but it's a pretty big departure, eh?
It was, yeah. And if it had just been called Spartacus, it could have done better, but maybe, that's a weird one. And so I learned a lot of lessons from that. And we chalk it up to a loss, and you move on. As long as as long as you're in a fortunate position where you've had some success in the past, you can have a couple of misfires. But you don't want to have too many, otherwise you're got to get a real job again.
Right. I can't remember how much of this I've heard you talk about on your channel versus private conversations. So you can let me know how much you're willing to share about that relationship with e-games and the decision to start with a new IP rather than to fit Swords and Sandals yet again into a new mold.
Yeah, absolutely. So e-games have been basically, I think they saved my life really, and metaphorically anyway. When things went bad at the old company, who I never name, it's sort of like a Voldemort thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
They're easy to track down, but actually I think they no longer exist, which is always heartwarming. But when things went bad there, and I kind of was in the wilderness for a couple of years, I ended up I was building Everyone Gets Treasure. I was building up a pirate game, which ended up being Sword and Sandals years later. But I was freelancing and just trying to figure out my way. About a year and a half later, I was able to get in touch with e-games and who'd bought the rights to Sword and Sandals, because it was sort of without me, it was sort of kind of dead in the water, and the old company weren't really building sort of games for Steam anymore and that kind of stuff. So when they took control of the franchise, I got in touch with them and said, hey, let's team up and let's remake some of these and see if we can do some sequels and so on. And it's been a really good partnership in terms of they are very hands-off for the most part in terms of creatively. They let me do what they want. They handle the marketing side and everything, and it's been a really good partnership for around about a decade now. So almost a decade. But what was I going to say? With Swords and Sandals, eventually you go back to the well a lot of times, and I have kind of built the Swords and Sandals just about every year for nearly a decade. Immortals, which is the latest one, took just nearly 2 years. And it's actually done relatively well, I think. I've been really happy with it. It's sort of what constitutes success on Steam these days. It depends on sort of what are you happy with. It's had 900 and something reviews, but because it's part of a Sword and Sandals bundle, the sales figures are considerably higher because they sort of pull each other up.
Right.
But that one was basically put everything into it, put everything into the game, all the best parts of the old Sword and Sandals, and then make it this sort of extravaganza with 50 arenas and 80 bosses and so on. When that was finished, I was just burned out on Swords and Sandals, completely burned out. And it felt like this series needs room to breathe for a while. So I spoke to them and said, look, I kind of think I need a break from Swords and Sandals. I'm going to build something else. And they said, well, do you want to, publish it with us? I said, look, I think I need to just try something new, pivot completely, and then, see what happens. So then I had a few ideas about what to do next, but the one that kept coming back to me was that Everyone Gets Treasure. And then I thought, what about let's make that real time and so on. So that's what ended up being Gorgon Shield. First of all, it was called Tower Shield, if you remember when we first started.
Yeah, which maybe not the most searchable title.
That was the problem, wasn't it?
It's so clever, such a clever title, but it didn't really.
It was a play on the whole, the actual Tower Shield.
Yeah, and you're a shield and a tower. It worked on every level.
But then you look at how many tower games there are, and it's and then people are thinking, is it tower defense and so on, and so it ended up being best, rebranded and so on. But then I thought this game just needs to be completely unique and just differentiated from Swords and Sandals, and you want to kind of see how you go without sort of riding the coattails of the past, and just sort of see how you go just on the same level ground as everyone else. And that's been really challenging because Swords and Sandals fans, to be honest, don't care about it. They only care about Swords and Sandals, and they've proven that to me time and time again. So you have to find a whole new audience, right?
Yeah, and I know when you entered this project, it was intended to be on the, what was it, like a 6-month? You were thinking you would do a pretty quick turnaround, and it ended up being closer to a year, more than a year now?
It was bang on a year, I think, maybe a year and a few weeks. So yeah, and you know, developer estimates are always the worst.
Double it is the usual advice, so I guess that worked out, eh?
Yeah, and like I'd hoped to do it in 6 months, but there was, I think, what slowed the game down was building it in 3D was not a mistake, but it was definitely technically harder than I thought. I'm using the Godot engine, which is good for 3D and getting better and better, but I'm still like, I'm way better at doing 2D, and so I found a lot of the challenges of 3D and, you know, and trying to just get things to load in without being jittery and, you know, textures and lighting and everything, and it's a real learning curve for me. So I feel like, well, the benefit of 3D versus could I have done it in 2D, it would have been quicker if we'd done it completely 2D, but then, you know, you learn from these things. But that was the main pain point, I think.
Do you think in future projects now you feel encouraged to play around with the 3D elements more? No.
I think not. I'm going to retreat.
That's too funny.
You sort of, I think you kind of know your strengths, and like, you know, like you know, not quite spiderweb software old, you know, Jeff Vogel, who's been doing this since, you know, the 90s with his fantasy games. He's sort of like the benchmark for the older game developers. But, you know, I'm in my mid 40s now, and I grew up on 2D, and I really, when like the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation 1 came out, a lot of people have huge nostalgia for that. But for me, that was a really dark time because I'd missed all the 2D games. All the developers and so on pivoted to 3D, but it was this really murky Tomb Raider brown kind of 3D that just for about 10 years was this wasteland of bad 3D games before they became good again. And so I don't have the nostalgia for it that other people do. And I kind of feel like you got to work with what you're passionate about and good at. And I think, you know, never say never, but I think what I'm best at is sort of just, you know, the 2D stuff.
So if you were to start Gorgon Shield over from scratch tomorrow, you would stick 2D?
I probably would, because, you know, we think about what are the advantages with 3D, and it's mainly just cool the shield rotates, but you can kind of fake that in 2D and so on. And
there's some cool lighting effects and things.
Yeah, the lighting is good, actually. The lighting definitely, so they're like, you know, to be honest, I mean, I really like the end result, and I love the sort of the kind of the arcade clunky 3D feel of it that you would find in the early arcades.
There is a little bit of a connection there, isn't there?
Yeah, and I don't know how well that is received, because what I find is it actually looks good in a video, but in a screenshot, it's very hard to capture that. You know what I mean? It's sort of when you take a screenshot of the game, you think, well, I know this game. It looks much better when it's running than it does in the screenshots, and that's been a real challenge. I don't know if you found that, but
just the other day I was kind of doing a screenshot review to think like, are there maybe some more representative parts of different aspects of the game that we could be subbing in? And right away I was just like, oh well, this combat one, I don't think that does like a very great job of showing what the combat of this game feels like. And I was playing around with trying to generate new screenshots, and I was like, well, it kind of doesn't look like anything half the time. Even though there's a ton of UI elements and things, but it's hard to know what the game is.
Completely, and it's so much better captured by video and so on, because you can kind of get straight away what's going on. And I'm sure there's lots of genres that are like that. There are some games, you know, like that are, you know, the games in the Unreal Engine, the big sort of the first-person shooters and the Souls-like games that instantly you can kind of go, this looks beautiful in 3D. But this game was just very challenging to get nice screenshots for, and I wonder how much that has sort of like made it harder to sort of reach a wide audience versus, you know, those other genres and so on. But when you see it in video, you kind of get it, I think. Oh yeah, cool. Things are moving quickly, and it's got this nice lighting and so on. And
even just the rotation itself, it has a nice snap and movement to it, and it keeps things flowing, and it just gives you a nice sense of control. So I think all that did turn out really well.
Yeah, totally. In the end, you know, and you learn a lot from that. You learn a lot about all the different techniques and so on, and how you can kind of, because essentially it's 2.5D really, in terms of like you've got little billboard sprites on big chunky 3D models. I did all the 3D modeling, and so that probably set me back a bit too, because I was like, got to learn Blender, you know.
Right. Oh, had you basically not even touched Blender prior to this? Wow.
No, I So
that's impressive that you managed to round that learning curve and still create a game in a year.
Yeah, sometimes it's sort of like, you know, you got to be careful, you bite off more than you can chew. But Blender is a great tool, and I really recommend it. You know, there's a famous donut tutorial where you can learn to make a spinning donut, and anyone that's ever done Blender ends up doing it. And I did this tutorial right at the end, and it was way more than you ever need. And okay, cool. I can probably go back and make some simple primitives now, you know, some simple cubes and triangles, and that I probably didn't need to go all that far. But it was really handy, you know, and just gave me the confidence to be able to make the simple models for the buildings and the tower stuff.
And in the end game, how much of the art was handled by someone else? Because I feel like I got the impression some of it was, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I did the tower models and the textures for them, and I did the portraits for the shopkeepers, and the monsters too. But the beautiful title screen art that you see with the Gorgon, you know, coming up and everything, was done by a great artist friend of mine called Alexander Terentev, who did pretty much all the art for Sword and Sandals Immortals, and so he stepped in to do that. And that's been probably like the number one kind of thing that people go, oh, that's really cool, is this beautiful title screen. He also did all the pixel art for the characters as well, for the hero characters.
Yeah, so he's got quite an influence on the final game then. Yeah.
And he's a really good artist and very quick and everything, and he had never really done much pixel art before, so it was a bit of a learning curve for him, because it's unusual. You sort of like, a lot of artists sort of, you know, are either pixel artists or real artists, but sometimes they want to switch over and try their hand at other things. And so he found it a bit of a challenge to translate to pixel art, but once he got rolling, it was really cool. And I thought it kind of, having said that, funny enough, if I was to do it all again, maybe I would pivot away from pixel art, just because it is, I know you're finding this lately, but there's been a real renaissance of like unique art styles. And in the same way that this sort of flash gamey kind of thing has gotten a resurgence, that sort of cool vector art sort of style that you're seeing in kind of games now. I think I've been
seeing a bit of that. Yeah.
I might have pivoted to that if I was to do it again starting today kind of stuff. But I'm really happy with it turned out, because that sort of suits the arcade theme. But if I was, you know, to do it differently again today, I might sort of go for that sort of more hand-drawn-y feel.
Yeah, you can save it for a Super Gorgon Shield, right?
Yeah, that's right. You know, when the game takes off and does millions.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing I was thinking, you know, you could easily remake this as sort of like, you know, Space Marine Shield or something, and there's like Space Marines, but they're going down into a base or something like that.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's very easy to reskin something like that, you know.
It is, I still think, a unique enough concept that I hope some dev out there comes across it and is inspired on some level by just mechanically, like, this is a fascinating, cool. Yeah.
There's no greater compliment than seeing sort of, you know, game mechanics or themes that you kind of have, you know, you think come up with, but then seeing them sort of like iterated on and done in a really innovative way. And it always surprises me, because I always thought, I'm always surprised there weren't more sort of Swords and Sandals kind of games out there. And I'd almost certainly think that Dark Dungeons wasn't influenced by Sword and Sandals, but I do see sort of some cool similarities there in terms of what the series could have turned into. And so it would be cool to see something with Gorgon Shield where people take that spinning kind of mechanism or the real-time party management and then sort of turn that into something that would be really cool to see.
You don't think there's a strong example where someone very clearly took Swords and Sandals and kind of made it their own sort of thing?
There is actually one great one, and I've spoken to these guys before, because I remember early on people emailing me going, these guys have stolen your game, they've ripped it off and done their own thing. And it's like, let me see. And the game was called let me see, what was it called? Because I ended up doing a bundle with them.
Such a funny
Um,
core part of that phrase, though, is that they've taken Swords and Sandals and done their own thing. It's like, well, the
no,
last
no,
half of that
exactly,
sentence is
yeah.
the important part.
Yeah, and how dare they? It's basically a 3D Swords and Sandals. It's turn-based and everything. I really liked it, and I ended up getting in touch with the developers. They're in Turkey, I believe, and Turkey was actually and I could be wrong. It could be either Turkey or maybe Israel. So obviously not the same country and so on, but that sort of region of the world. 100% Sword and Sandals. And that was the only game I've ever seen that was like straight up one-to-one. This is going to be. I did see actually a few years later. I saw an NFT game that was completely ripping off Swords and Sandals because they contacted me and said, "Do you want to do an NFT thing?" I said, "No interest." So they started it and they abandoned it, which was good.
Oh yeah, that's good. That's another one of those ones where you're a little thankful maybe when something doesn't go the distance.
Like leave me out of this kind of thing. But yeah, I would always love, see those kind of games are really my sort of favorite. Those quick sort of role-playing games, but they're done really quickly, and your turns are fast and everything. Because the older I get, the less time you have, unfortunately, to play games. And so your attention span has changed and everything.
Which is, I don't want to go too deep on Lair of the Leviathan because I don't know. Well, I would love to help you down the line do a Swords and Sandals video, promote that a little bit. But it is kind of funny to say, because I feel the intended scale of that game is quite large, right? So maybe there's a sense that if you are going to commit more than a couple hours to a game, you want it to be substantial. Like, do you like mid-range games, or do you want it short or long?
Yeah, and this very much is a project that has sort of come about because I've always hoped to do my own Ultima style game. I always, have been obsessed with those kind of games from growing up. Again, it comes back to building the games you liked as a kid and so on. Yeah. And I'd hoped to do my own, and then I applied to get some funding from the government, which fell through, and then I was feeling a bit sort of down about everything, where it's all going wrong. But a few days later, the developer of Lair of the Leviathan got in touch with me just for other reasons. We started talking, and then decided to team up. The reason I was interested in that game is because of it's almost like the opposite of all the things that I've ever done in terms of just the sheer scope of it. Sword and Sandals Immortals comes closest to the scope, but this is probably a 3 or 4 year project. But for the first time, I'm working with another developer / artist who is sort of equally on board as I am. And when you hire artists or contract musicians and so on, you're sort of paying them for their time, but they do their hours and they're done. But when you're as sort of invested as someone else, and you'll build yourself up, you build each other up, and you both will do your best because you both want it to succeed rather than just because you're getting paid. Yeah,
you guys can feed off each other's passion for the genre and really put some personality into it through that.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm kind of terrified because this is a huge project. This is just looking at the scope of it. We're basically trying to make not Baldur's Gate 3 big, obviously, because they have hundreds of developers and so on. But if you could take a Baldur's Gate 1 kind of that's sort of the early Baldur's Gate kind of games, that sort of scale and things like that. That's what we're trying to build here, and good luck. But in the meantime, because it's a big 3 or 4 year project, there might come a time where I take a couple of months out to do something small again, because you do sometimes need to pivot a little bit, or you need to put food on the table,
right.
I've got to try and yeah, that's right. So we'll see what happens, but it might be that 4 years is sort of a long time between Sword and Sandals games. So every now and again I kind of think, should I go back to the well and do a quick reskin of a Sword and Sandals game? But you don't want to do it in a cynical way, because you still have to have the passion for it. Otherwise people will realize that you're just doing cheap reskins and so on.
Right. If that were your only motivator, it might be a little transparent, eh?
Yeah, 100%. And it often is the case. You see all these for like, they've thrown in like horse armor DLC or whatever it is, from Skyrim.
Although I do kind of miss that a little bit from the Flash days, where you had a game that was successful and then you had two options of reuse the art and pump out a sequel, or keep the engine, update the art, and do a direct sequel. You barely change anything, but it's like, oh great, more free of the thing I liked. I'm in.
and it worked. It worked so well with Flash games because they were such bite-sized pieces of entertainment. It was perfect for that, and you could really easily reskin them and so on. And Flash was just an amazing engine for stuff like that. The original Swords and Sandals, I made in about 2 or 3 months.
Wow!
And then Swords and Sandals 2, I literally just took, I took the same file, that same FLA file, and then just started adding to it, and it was exactly the same graphics, same sound, and everything. I just added a bunch more rules and stuff like that. So it was literally just the same graphics, the same thing, and just expanded enough that you call it a sequel. So I'm all for that in certain cases, and it makes a lot of sense to sort of like, if you've done all this work on an engine or or this beautiful art, to think about how else could I repurpose this.
Yeah, absolutely. Does it hurt you at all to be in a commercial development space where that's almost looked down upon? People would feel that that's lazy.
Totally, and I think you sort of it does for a little while, but then you learn to just go, whatever. Like, there's always going to be people who complain about this, but there's a silent majority of people in general be okay with reuse of some things. To a point, I don't know. No matter what you do, people, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Right. Hopefully, as long as the experience feels fresh, then people will not mind so much if something is reused.
Because you could completely take something like, for example, Gorgon Shield. You could take the art or the characters and everything, and the setting, everything, and turn that into a Darkest Dungeon style side-on, turn-based dungeon crawler. Mm-hmm. It's literally got all the assets for something like that, for this really sort of casual version of that, if you're so inclined. So there's always ways to sort of, if you want to, the way to stay on, successful might be not the best term, but like to stay afloat in this industry, which gets more and more competitive, is to be smart with things like that and reuse assets and engines and so on where you can, but just do it in a way that doesn't feel completely obvious and still feels a bit creative and fresh.
I mean, that must have been a scary safety net, to switch engines entirely and start over, throw away years of practice and knowledge.
To be honest, I was so glad to do it, because as much as I love Flash, it does have limitations compared to something like Unity or Godot. There are some things certainly with styling especially, where it's just very fiddly. Flash itself takes, when you're compiling a file, it now takes, a few minutes to do, and Adobe Air is getting harder and harder to work with, and it's really showing its age. So like, I find I was a massive Flash evangelist for many, many years, and I still have massive nostalgia for it, but using it now to patch my old games and so on, I find it a real challenge compared to firing up something in Godot or even going, because they're dedicated game engines. In Flash, you still had to build a game engine around it. And
I guess
Flash is the best animation tool I've ever used, but as a game engine, it was still, you had to still do everything yourself.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, when I posed the question, I was picturing the transition from Unity to Godot. But I guess it's not your first rodeo. Hey,
no. And I actually, I failed at Unity. I'm going to be honest. I wasn't very good at Unity. I built one game in it. Actually, no, I built 2 games many, many years. It's no longer on the App Store, but I made a game called Dark Rolls. So instead of like Dark Souls, it was a marble maze game.
Okay.
In a castle. And it was bad and it did poorly. It was just a mobile game. But that was the two Unity games I made. But after I made Spartacus, I just realized that there's something about Unity that I just struggle with. It's a little bigger than I'm used to scope-wise, and it has many, many moving components, and every file is a gigabyte in size, and it has all these extra bits and pieces that I just never quite sort of could reconcile myself with. But Godot is kind of feels like that nice halfway space between Flash and Unity for me anyway, where this really feels like a lightweight engine. It's only like 40 megabytes to download, and it loads up like that and then instantly kind of runs and stuff like that. So it really is just it feels to me like a really natural successor to Flash, and the language is easy to use, and that's why I'm seeing a lot of up and coming game devs getting on board with Godot, just because it is so easy to use.
You were, I think, in the middle of development when I'm forgetting the timeline now of when Unity kind of, you know,
Yeah.
threw it all away, and then Godot got a
Yeah.
bunch of rounds of funding and everything. And I'm curious if you had transitioned because of that, or partially, you know.
No, it was that was a happy coincidence.
Oh,
it was like
right
it was
on.
about, yeah. So Sword and Sounds Immortals was the first game we did in Godot, and that was 2022 or something like that. So I think I'm about my third year of using it, and that was just because of my own, as a reasons I just explained. But I think maybe last year when the whole EA, the John Riccatello guy was the Unity CEO, and he's
That sounds right.
journalists
About
like, you're gonna pay for every download now and everything. So I was well off that, but there was a real sense of smugness, I guess, from a lot of people, because Unity is an amazing engine. It is like some of the games I've seen in Unity will rival, and some AAA games are made in it, and it does things that even now Godot cannot do, and it will be a few years before Godot can catch up to it. So as an engine, it is this brilliant thing, but the business practices seem to get more and more shady. And also with Unity, there's this real fragmentation inside the Unity team of what do they want to be? Do they want to be this fully AAA game making tool, or is it for indies? Is it for like commercial animation? And they're trying to just go in all the different directions. They're abandoning old components and things that used to work. And so a lot of people that use Unity are like, we don't have enough direction from you guys. We're kind of worried about the future. And that's why I think a lot of people sort of jump ship.
That is really nice that you had already made the transition yourself. Having made a game in Godot prior to all of the funding and support and new devs, and I'm sure tutorials, documentation, all that growing as you're already using it. Did you benefit much from that, or did it almost confuse some of what you were attempting?
No, it was really good. I definitely benefited from being like, and Godot's been around a lot, actually, for quite a long time, even though it's only been on the roadmap in the last few years. I think it's nearly a 10-year-old piece of software, maybe even longer, but for a long time it was not very, not well known at all. And I only learned about it in sort of the early 2020s. But being one of the early kind of relatively popular sort of Godot developers, at least with a recognizable brand using it and so on, I got a lot of support from Godot, and I was on the Godot showcase page and everything, and I think it in a small way probably helped with the confidence of other developers to go, hey, look, these guys are using it, we can use it as well. And so that definitely boosted me. And good thing with Godot is, at least from my outsider perspective, it does seem the developers are very approachable, and you can kind of ask them things. And in the same way that the early Unity used to be like that. And I remember trying out Unity in 2010 or something, and you could even get in touch with the CEO back then. It was a guy, I can't remember what his name was, but you could email him on, you could hit him on Twitter and everything, and he'd go, hey, this, and this, but now you'd have no chance.
No, I have no idea who's in charge of that now, but certainly someone who has scraped off their millions and probably disappeared from the world of actual development.
Yeah, and I never want to kind of discourage anyone from using Unity at all, because it is like a piece of software. It's remarkable, and it is still the best tool for the job for many things. But there is certainly a benefit and appeal to having open source software, where you're not immune, but you're sort of better protected from things like, the company saying, you're now charging for every piece of software, every download, and we're taking a cut. That can't just happen in something like Godot. So that is kind of a nice thing. The same way that why Blender's probably become so popular, there's a sort of real open source sort of renaissance again.
Oh, absolutely. As more and more of these softwares go to subscription models where your annual fee doesn't actually seem to go anywhere.
Yeah, totally. Like, you just look at, Adobe's the best example of that.
Yeah.
Like, what are we still paying for? Photoshop hasn't changed in 10 years.
Premiere
not
crashes on me and corrupts files all the time.
Totally. It's nuts, right? It's like, this isn't getting better,
Yeah.
Sad.
Yeah, that's absolutely the central feeling there.
Yeah.
I think kind of in the story I'm attempting to paint, and any tangents are nice as well. Whenever I craft a video like this, it's really fun to just
totally.
start at a big scale and start chipping away, like interesting, like turn it into a story a little bit. And the way I'm kind of picturing it currently, I think I'm missing a little bit of I don't know, the day you flipped through your game design notebook. A couple things there. The first of which, I guess, was there anything else in there that you were like, I got to pick between these two? Or was it pretty confidently Everyone Gets Treasure was what spoke to you?
Yeah, I wish I still had the notebook, because I had this. I might even still have it. Let's see. I might have it here. I've got this notebook here, which is my one from many years ago. This was Sword and Sandals 2. I'm looking through.
It's got notes from back.
These are notes like this. Literally, what became Sword and Sandals 2 Redux, which is the remake of the old one.
Okay. So this isn't quite a 15-year-old notebook or whatever that would have to be.
but you can see here, this was early things for the Gorgon Shield. So you had not Gorgon, but Everyone's Get Treasure, and there was, your characters there, and then you'd have.
Ooh, could you hold that up again? Almost actually.
Yeah. So
it almost looked like there was one platform that things come from, and you would move. Oh, but then there's still the healing. There's the treasure, and the ranged platform. Okay, it's funny that took so long to make it into Gorgon Shield.
Exactly.
In your notes.
And then you have this was sort of the this is what every platform could do. You'd have the range, you have the healing, and it was very much. This is even I think there's an earlier version than this one, because it kind of revisited it after a while. But it was very much side on. The monsters would come out and they'd fall off, and your hero. So that's not that far from what we did, but yeah. So to answer your question better, the original one had a lot more monsters, a lot more abilities. So I ended up cutting out the abilities, because it ended up sort of being one. It was hard to convey what those abilities did and how you could sort of combat them. In a turn-based game, you can. It's very easy to sort of say, this monster has a stun attack and will stun your heroes, but it's takes double damage against fire or something like that. But when you're doing this real-time thing with monsters coming out, you don't have a lot of time to read things, or you're not really seeing why your character is being stunned. And when you've only got sort of a few options for attacking, it's very hard to kind of use various strategies that might work in a turn-based game, but you don't have enough different options to use that in a real-time game. So I ended up cutting out a lot of that for Gorgon Shield that was in Everyone Gets Treasure. The other big thing, which I can't remember if I ever told you about, but one of the big hooks for Everyone Gets Treasure, and what I was hoping to do in Gorgon Shield, was that when your character would die at the end of the game, you'd have a choice between, because it was a game show, you could resurrect them, and they would either sort of be a hero and they'd end up on the wall, or if you didn't pay to resurrect them, they would be resurrected and they'd come back as an enemy in the game. And so you'd get to a certain platform, and the hero would come out from a previous adventure, and you'd have to fight them.
I think I remember reading about that in, I think it was a Newgrounds blog post where you were just kind of musing on your ideas for the game. That does sound familiar to me.
That sounds right.
It's funny because I think something like that became. I guess it's not quite the same, but I was picturing Rogue Legacy. If you played that one 10 years ago, it had a really similar sort
absolutely. The traits that continue.
Yeah, and so it would tie your runs together, which is funny that you had something like that in a game that probably wasn't in any other way using rogue-like tropes.
Yeah, totally.
So it's kind of funny because presumably those. Is a run even the right way to think of it? I guess arcade. You sit down, you play it, you win or you lose, and it's not really so much about the long-term improvements.
Yeah, there's no meta around it or anything.
Yeah.
No meta progression. But that was the idea of, you would have the characters that you sort of built up and invested in come back as bad guys that you had to fight. But what I found when I was building Gorgon Shield was that as the game progressed, the individual identity of each character was kind of minimized because the runs, they can go for 10, 20 minutes, but the characters aren't named. It's just red wizard, green wizard, and so on. And they're almost a unit that you're sort of like leveling up. But the individual characters themselves aren't so memorable. And so when you bring them back, you're not really going to remember like, oh, that was the red wizard from, the run I did, on last Thursday or something, and I give them all this cool gear. And so it ended up just being a little sort of redundant. It didn't quite work how I wanted. Originally, I thought that there would be more. The one run would be much longer, and each character would have names, care about them a lot more. But in the end, it just didn't suit the fast-paced repeats of the game, because the more you put into these characters and so on, the more effort it is, and then you kind of less likely to want to do another run. It's sort of like when you have a wipe in Darkest Dungeons. It's like, I'll put all that effort into these characters, and now they're gone.
It immediately made me think of Darkest Dungeon again, because you have whatever Larry, the warrior on your team that is, you've had him since the beginning, and 20 hours in, you lose him, and it's the most devastating. It doesn't quite feel the same when you just have Green Wizard number 8 from your run last Tuesday.
Exactly, and because you sort of, the idea of like restarting each run with new heroes and so on, if you were to bring the old heroes back like you do in Darkest Dungeon and go on new runs, the game would very quickly be over, because there's only a certain amount of levels. If your characters get very powerful, you power through them very quickly, and then it's done. But with new heroes each time, the benefit is you can sort of try new strategies, slowly get meta powerful around them. But the negative of that is you don't have the identities anymore. And I thought about random name generators, but ended up one of the reasons I didn't use the random name generators and everything, quite like the sort of the voiceover saying, Red Wizard is about to die kind of thing. Which was that's all you, right? Well.
You're doing those with a voice modifier of some kind?
Yeah, just a vocoder filter, which I got online, which is a site you can just go to and put your voice through the vocoder.
No, I think that's I really enjoy the narrator aspect of things, but again, I think it's one of those things where turn-based versus action, if you're not sitting and spending time with the characters, and mostly you're just paying attention to your little cooldown bars and your health bar, and you're just trying to stay alive, you're not thinking so much about Gary's in trouble. It's like, no, it's just, oh god, I gotta move, I gotta heal, I gotta
And I think one of the reasons to keep them anonymous is almost what I was sort of realizing when seeing people playing is that it's very hard to convey this to a player, but like the heroes are meant to be expendable. Their job is to keep the shield alive as long as possible. Don't get too attached to them; they're going to die. Even more so than like a Darkest Dungeon, where heroes are going to get attached. I was trying to I don't want you to be attached to these heroes, because they're only going to last 5 minutes, and they're almost like just 4 parts of a unit. Closer to like sort of soldiers in an RTS game, where you don't really care about warrior number 7 in your little group. So that's why not naming them kind of lends itself to. I only just thought about that then, actually.
Oh, fine.
How it ties in.
I am curious, when you pulled out that old notebook, if it was just a matter of time and distance from it, that the game show theme felt pretty original. But then did you just feel like I have such a deep-rooted knowledge of RPGs and those tropes, and I'll just, that's in my back pocket, I don't even have to think about it? Like, did that motivate it a little?
Partly. It was partly just kind of like I wanted it to feel a little lighter, and still sort of coming off the whole Flash era where everything is kind of a little whimsical and a little bit sort of irreverent, and I thought this ties into that. And it was also like, even the name Everyone Gets Treasure was a bit of a play on back in the day where, the Oprah Winfrey show, where she would just give cars to everyone. It's like, you get a car, everyone's getting a car. And
I had to assume that was an Oprah.
Yeah, and this was basically that, And it's like, you're getting treasure, you're getting treasure, you're getting treasure. You know, at the end of the level, they'll throw treasure at him. But it's sort of, it was a bit of a kind of like a bit of a joke, and then it ended up not. It was that, you know, originally with when I started doing Gorgon Shield, that was one of the. I was thinking of continuing that theme, except it started off with a game show. Then I thought of actually having it as like Death was the host or something like that. And one of the early, in the design document, one of the sort of, there's a bunch of different names, and there was sort of like there's a real play on words on sort of, you know, escaping death and so on, and cheating death and that kind of thing. And Death was the host, and eventually you'd succumb to him, and then he'd bring you back as one of the evil heroes and so on. But I went away from that, and I don't remember exactly why, because it was a cool idea. Then it turned into the idea, it might have been, I thought about doing like Dante's Inferno, but that was been done a lot. And then in the end, I pivoted to Gorgon Shield and the Greek theme only because I had to rename it from Tower Shield. And the first thing I thought of was like, okay, Ancient Greece, Gorgons, done. And I didn't actually give it as much thought as sort of you'd imagine.
It's a cool sounding name, so just...
Yeah, like I need a monster at the top of this tower. What's a cool monster that isn't sort of done to death, and it's sort of, you see a lot of dragons and demons and so on.
Yeah.
You know, and so there's not that many Medusa, Gorgon-y type games, and so I thought, you know, Ancient Greece is a thing, even though that's sort of, it's kind of partly Greece, but it still has a lot of the legacy of before that, where you have wizards and, you know, everything. And so I just said, you know what? You know, it's almost like when you play old JRPGs, and they might be set in ancient Greece and so on, but they seem to have a, you know, fairly limited understanding of like Western mythology, and they'll still put in, you know, medieval knights and so on, even though it's supposed to be like, you know, set in ancient Greece and so on. And this kind of like ends up being like that, where it's like, don't think about it too much. There's a Chinese general in there. There's like, you know, a medieval priest. You know,
they found their way over. It's
yeah. There's only two sort of classes that actually really feel ancient Greek, and that's sort of like the oracle and the gladiator. You know,
it is funny because even though the Gorgon Shield, it's right there in the title, and then Talos and the other bosses, like, it's right there in front of me, and at no point have I ever really thought of it as a Greek themed game. I think I just think of it as fantasy.
Totally. And I did a really rudimentary, like, change some of the names to sort of Corinthian and, you know, Spartan and Achilles and so on, but that's really, really surface level. So it is because the game was already sort of 4 months into dev or something when I renamed it, and I was like, you know what, it doesn't matter. People don't care enough, you know.
So yeah, okay, that's funny that the Gorgon was just kind of the first one that came to mind. Literally up until that point, was it still Death, even though you had moved away from the game show thing?
Yeah, it actually still was. That's right. And it's funny to think, like, because I kind of had originally thought it would have been cool to have multiple towers, and you go from tower to tower, unlocking the next tower. You beat each tower. So imagine that the first run would be like, you know, get to level 10, then that tower is done, then you get to another tower appears and so on, and you go back. But then it ended up being sort of like just easier to put it all into one tower and sort of make it go longer and longer.
That was quite a lot of the stuff, I think, when I first got involved and we were swapping ideas back and forth. Like at one point it was a tower all the way up to level 100, and like there were quite a few things that changed around that time.
Definitely. And it was really hard getting that balance right, because, you know, what is a good balance between this being challenging and deep, but without being exhausting. And is 100 levels too repetitive? You know, it's ended up being 60 levels, which is probably on the upper level of what you know is manageable. I've finished it, but it's very hard. So.
Right. What's like the least meta you've beaten it with? Like, I don't think you can beat it at 0, right?
No, you definitely, and that was one of the things I don't know the SD, the game doctor, doesn't like at all, is that he sort of thinks that, you know, you should be able to beat a game without it. I get that, but there's also sort of like, there's a proven kind of, a lot of people kind of, the lizard brain in people does like being able to sort of have some kind of like, hey, this run wasn't in vain. I have upgraded a bit. The same way that one of the things that really drew me to Rogue Legacy, I love upgrading as you go and getting, just permanent little upgrades and so on. And I wanted that in Gorgon Shield. And I think with Gorgon Shield, as long as if you can get enough runes on the shield and unlock some rune slots, so like having 4 lasers or like 2 lasers and 2 healing, so on, it really makes the game easier. And then when you go wagon, if you can get a couple of upgrades on the shields, armor, and so on, you can definitely you can put, like, I feel like if you do a couple of hours, maybe, saving up runs and spending gold on those kind of things, eventually, and you also get better at playing the game, right? You can start to sort of really just the balance shifts in your favor, and there's a couple of strategies, and it'll be really interesting strategies that people come up with, because there's a couple of things that I sort of discovered in just playing the game as a player that seem to be really powerful strategies. If you have a wizard, they have the fireball attack, and if you go, all right, I got 4 heroes, but I'm only going to power up the wizard. If you power up their power and then reduce their cooldown, you can just be spamming this fireball attack all the time, and it ends up not quite breaking the game, but it makes it a lot easier.
Oh, I like that you didn't necessarily cut those sorts of things off. Like maybe within the first, if there's some sort of post-launch support patching, clean up bugs or whatever, maybe you'll find a few exploits where you're like, well, that's a little too easy, but that'll be a lot of fun to see, especially with the freedom of party composition, that you can do 4 wizards if you wanted and juice them all with fireballs.
Or have 4 priests that are always healing each other and that kind of thing.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I kind of, people don't, like, you as a developer, your first thought is this game should be completely balanced and it should be fair for everyone and so on, but a lot of people do like being able to exploit a game and feeling powerful, and I think sometimes it can be a mistake to sort of take away some of those things for people. And if you want to use exploits and that to finish the game, maybe that's just your time is valuable. It should be okay for you to do that, and because this is a single player game as well, there's less inclination to have to balance it perfectly for multiplayer. So I'm okay with if people decide that, like, hey, this is the strategy to win the game, as long as it's not completely busted and it makes it unviable to do any other strategy,
right?
Then I'm okay with sort of things like that. And I think one of the things that really made me realize where the heart of the game is, and what made me sort of decide to sort of stop building all the other mini game ideas, and that the magic of the game is just in composing the right party and having fun with, who am I leveling up? Am I going to level up one guy or sort of spread this throughout these guys? Is the barbarian underpowered? Where are our weaknesses? And then just sort of being on next run, think about that, and just slowly build up this sort of like synergy of your group. And I think that's it was only late in the development of the game did I realize that the party composition is where the heart of the fun is in the game.
I do think that they've reached a point where I do just hit random now. You have the heroes unlocked, and it's like, well, it's not really as fun to have determined that this is my favorite composition. So when I play now, I just hit random and let it go.
Yeah, see what works, right?
Yeah.
Because essentially they are, you can mold those characters however you want to be to a certain point. There are certain healing characters, certain characters that are certain things, but essentially you can have a barbarian that ends up great at range damage, or you can have a priest that ends up being your main melee hero once you get a couple of cool melee upgrades, good boots or something like that. So
which I find that fun. Flexible, it's nice.
Yeah, and you don't always want to be spending 10 minutes before each run thinking about your party composition, because they are expendable and you can upgrade them along the way and then see how you... I'm sort of, now that I'm realizing I wanted this game to feel like a coffee break game that you can just sit down, do a run, get a little bit further than you did before, get a little bit of gold, upgrade, and then come back next lunchtime, next coffee break or whatever, and not feel like you have to play this for hours and hours and get burnt out on it. Because it's the kind of game that I people always ask me, do you finish your games? And I kind of, most of the time I go, yeah, but with cheats, you know, like a lot of my games I get bored of because I've been playing for, you know, a year or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But with Gorgon Shield, I still find that I come back to it and enjoy it just in terms of like a quick run. But then after 1 or 2 runs, I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm done for today. But then I feel like a few days later, yeah, come back and do it again.
We've seen that a lot with Rack and Slay, and the funny thing is how often, like you're saying, you can't make a game for everyone, and so it's funny that game really dedicatedly was like, this is a 10 to 20 minute coffee break game, and he decided that from day one, and it informed every decision. The game is as casual as it possibly could have been kept, and people are upset about that. They want to be able to curve the ball and do the trick shots and be really fancy and show off. It's like, well, it's not for you then. It's for the people
not
who
that kind of game.
Yeah.
You have other pool games for that. And by the way, you know, Rack and Slay, genius idea. I loved it. As soon as I saw it, I instantly got it.
Right.
Yeah, combining dungeon crawling and pool, and the mechanics of pool are instantly just fun, right? And people get them, and you can use all the different tactics and so on. And I totally get that. But then you're going to have like the full-on, you know, the pool enthusiasts that want to do all those tricks, and it's like, but they're not part of the game, you know. Sometimes you have to go, this is what the game is. And like you say, if you try to make a game for everyone, you make no one.
It's a really tough thing to ask players to meet you and the game, rather than like they're waiting for you to bring it to them in some ideal format. And
it's so hard because you do get so much feedback, and you know, you're constantly sort of questioning yourself, am I doing the right thing here? Is this person's feedback just something that they've thought of on a whim, or is this actually like a really, you know, a clever idea that I need to miss? And sometimes you just have to back yourself, because although, you know, you can get blind to things, no one has played your game more than you, and then you did actually spend a lot of time thinking about why you put this in. So you got to be careful with, you know, to be true to yourself and not sort of dilute your ideas too much.
Trying not to focus on the entire game, but maybe is there a specific mechanic or portion of Gorgon Shield where you had a moment of identity crisis or doubt that it wasn't, or maybe many? Yeah. Lots.
In particular, it was, although I love the nostalgic vibe of the labyrinth, it was an idea that I wasn't quite sure how far to go with it. And it does sometimes, I can see how some people might go, oh, the labyrinth, I don't want to do the labyrinth. It does in some ways feel a little bit tacked on compared to the main game. But I like the variety of it, but I can see how it's not as in depth as like even a Gauntlet, Diablo, or a Hammerwatch, or those kind of traditional action role playing games. And so I very deliberately thought, you know what, this needs to go for no less than a minute, and there needs to be lots of incentives for you to go in there, like treasure chests and healing and the ability to level up quickly, because mechanically it's not as strong as the tower thing. So I was kind of like, I nearly thought, look, you know, it's still fun. So that was the number one thing. Everything else I was pretty happy with.
Oh, great. That's really good.
Yes, to be honest.
This actually, it's not really so much a question. It just came up earlier when I was recording a little bit of Gorgon Shield, putting some footage together. I did a couple stops through the labyrinth, and I across the 3 different labyrinth floors or whatever, I must have grabbed 9-10 treasure chests, something in that scale, and I think it was gold every single time. Did you take out the loot in the labyrinth?
No, it's definitely there. It's definitely there, but it must be just like sometimes you're unlucky, you know.
Yeah, because I always found it in quite a balance, and I was like, oh, he must have changed something, but I just roll the dice.
I will check again, because I'm pretty sure I didn't. Sometimes, you know, you can inadvertently
right.
something else, but I'll check that again just out of interest, because it is supposed to be there, and you should be able to. I think it's something like, you know, not a 50-50 chance, but it's something like a 30% chance to get loot or something. But it's definitely something that you want to be in there, because, you know, otherwise you're only getting loot through power-ups or going to the snakes and ladders kind of levels.
Yeah, I think it's quite important to be trickling that in, because it does alter the characters and
absolutely. Yeah, I'll check that out after the call, actually, because I'm curious. I did, yeah. It's definitely the loot thing is. Also, we talked about lots of different cool ideas on loot, and I would have, in a perfect world, loved to have a bit more with the variety of interesting effects that the loot could do. But in the end, it's sort of with every new sort of mechanism you add, it gets more and more complicated to try and explain to the player why something happening, why a lightning appearing here, and why all of a sudden this character is healing and so on. Because you have 4 characters, trying to remember what their gear is and everything, it just gets sort of like, it was already getting wildly out of hand with, I'm just trying to keep track of like what is going on any particular level. And I remember watching SD play and just seeing him kind of flounder a bit with what was actually going on at all, that I realized that any extra level of complexity might just tip the shield. That might be the end.
Did you find improving the tutorialization was the best way to address that, or did you have to trim things up a little bit?
Bit of both. I think I worked. You and I went through the tutorials a lot, and I think in the end the tutorial has been pretty. Now it's a good balance of like, it doesn't take too long, but it explains things as best it can. But you still need to assume that most people won't do the tutorial playing that they don't know how to play the game. Oh
my goodness, yeah. The nightmare of every developer is, no matter how well tutorialized, it's
yeah. And as a developer, it's tutorials are one of the most annoying things to make, just because you have to put so many conditionals in a game. Like, where usually the game has all these rules, but they have to go, well, if the tutorial is on, then after 10 seconds show this message, and then don't allow this, and then you have all this kind of yucky code that it's just specifically for tutorial. But I then also had to make sure that, okay, let's really limit what appears in the first few levels, regardless. So in the first level, you only see these platforms, and you only see the simple monsters and so on like that. So it very much, and even now, it still can get a little, overwhelming for players after sort of 4 or 5 levels. But at some point, you do have to demand something of the player and say, look, this game does require a bit of investment, and if you don't want it, then this is the game that I've made. It does require that. Roguelikes are great, the traditional roguelike systems, they demand things of the player, and that audience is much more prepared to learn. But often, in the more sort of roguelike or roguelite, which one is it? It's roguelite or something, which is sort of roguelike adjacent, which is kind of what we're building, with roguelike elements, with different mechanics. And players are much more like, I don't understand this, I'm out. And so that's a challenge, as we talked about. It's a huge challenge. I don't know if I've successfully done.
I'm not even sure if it's the right thing to pursue or to focus your efforts on, like it's certain people just aren't gonna click with it, and and you have to be okay with that, and you're not going to make a game that's necessarily going to appeal to everyone. But if you can make a game for an audience that is passionate, even if it's a smaller audience, but they're dedicated to it, then I think you have it's success in its own way, even if it's not a commercial hit or anything. But if you found a small group of people who are like, we love this game, want to know more, then the worst thing you can make is a game that people are indifferent. You know what I mean? That is sort of like no one talks about because no one has an opinion on. Same with any piece of media, right? It's unfortunate with the landscape of how many games are releasing per day, the amount of games that will be forgotten just because of the quantity rather than that indifference. It's just a shame.
It is. I think about it all the time, and earlier in our chat we're talking, the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation brought all these 3D games out, and I had this whole wasteland of 10 years where I was playing these games I didn't necessarily like at all. But I look now at these modern games and I go, I love this game. I love this game. I would love to play any of these games, but you only have a limited time and a limited, budget, whatever it is. And so all these games are going to just float by, and you just see, I'll never get to play those games. I don't know if you know that channel, Play Me Game.
Yeah.
Who does these indie games sort of every few days. He's like, here are the hit games coming out this week, or the games being released this week. and he does a video every day or two.
Yeah.
And
oh my goodness, a lot of videos.
yeah, a lot of videos, but a lot of games in those videos.
Oh,
and
yeah.
I look at them going, these are amazing. And I'm going to be like the first to admit that a lot of these young developers, run rings around me just in terms of technical and fresh ideas and so on. I go, the next generation of game devs are just awesome and really just coming to it with enthusiasm and excitement and so on. But the great shame of it is, like, it's really hard to get people to play those games. And for every hit, there's going to be 10 games that no one will play for no fault of their own, other than maybe like your video that did, you released the game and the same day this 10 hidden cats things appeared. And so
right.
through no fault of your own, no one played your game. And, it's rough. It's scary. The market is just getting more and more competitive and challenging and mature, I guess.
I am curious, with such a wealth of new games coming out, when you do find time to play things on your own, are you more drawn to games that share that are either one similar to games you make, because then you can kind of mix it into your own brain stew of ideas, or in a similar vein, games that clearly pulled from the same inspirations that you did? Or do you like to totally break free and go play Mario or something, Yeah,
it's a great question. So what I tend to do is, if I'm at the PC here in my home office, well, I download a lot of game demos, indie games, and I'll only ever play those games on the PC. And I'll check out the mechanics, and I'll kind of go, yeah, this is a game I would definitely enjoy, but it never goes much further than that. I played a game called Death Must Die the other day, which is like a really super polished Vampire Survivors. And I could see I was playing about 10 minutes and really enjoying the game loop and go, oh yeah, this is fantastic. But then I stopped and I never went back to it, because if I'm at the PC, I kind of like, I got to be working. And so I absorb indie games mechanically. But when I want to play for fun, because I've got 2 boys now, we play the Switch all the time. So it's all this Super Mario and games that are very, games that I'd never make, but, are brilliant fun. And then every now and again, I'll sit down and play a AAA. I'm really into like the Dark Souls-y kind of games, even though I'm old and don't have the twitch muscles for them anymore. But I just like the atmosphere, or Ghost of Tsushima, or Red Dead Redemption, that kind of game like that, which is sort of like, the big event games that come along that are the billion-dollar budgets and that kind of thing. So I play those just for fun, but without really knowing that much of it is gonna, seep into your own game dev, just because it can't, because it's, the budgets are so wildly different.
Maybe that's one of the only ways to allow that to remain a hobby. Because if you're playing things too similar to your own game, you're playing it critically and you're analyzing everything.
Absolutely.
And then if it has nothing to do with your interest as a developer, or is beyond your ability to achieve like the scale of Red Dead or Elden Ring or what have you, there's a little of freedom. You can just enjoy it and know that it's not. Yeah.
You nailed it. It's exactly that. The closer the game is to what you're making, the more you're thinking of actually having fun with it.
I feel like we've covered a lot of ground at this point.
Yeah.
There were 2 kind of interesting things that came to mind. Both that I was using Dead Estate as kind of a point of reference, even though in Gorgon Shield, roguelike is the only thing that they're really going to have in common. Yeah. It's a funny thing there, where that game very specifically was like, okay, no meta progression. This is a skill-based game. You have to get good at it to beat it. But then people pick up the game and buy it who have just spent the last 10 years playing every roguelike that's ever released, and they win on their first run. And it's like, this game is punishing, and it throws a lot at you, and it's got a couple quirks and things, and people win right away, and they drop a negative review, played for 30 minutes, product refunded, this was too easy. And it's like, well, you only saw 10% of the game at best. Like,
it's crazy, right? And what can you do about that as a developer? Because, you've designed the game, for everyone, not for everyone, but for, to make it challenging for
leaning
everyone.
Hard, yeah.
Yeah, but then you get these outlier players, the same players that can finish Dark Souls using like pads, the dance pads,
right?
Without being hit, blindfolded. So, and that's really hard. I got a review on Swords and Sandals Immortals literally yesterday. that 32 hours played, thumbs down, and they're saying this game is really unbalanced when you play it on the Hellscape difficulty, which is a difficulty that I made as a huge challenge. And they said, the balance is terrible. It's not in your favor at all. And I said, yeah, that's what it's designed to be. But because you didn't like it, you give it a thumb down. I said, the only actual balance that this game is on normal. Everything else, all bets are off. So it's hard. It's really hard to develop a balancing, and like I said, Dead Estate, and to design it to be this, really perfectly, a challenging run that you go through, and then could take you a long time. But what can you do about those players that are so good? And it's like, well, they're going to review the game in a negative, and that influence other players who skill levels are not going to be anywhere near guys, but they're going to go, well, the game sounds too easy, but without even trying it.
The Hellscape one is funny. That's yeah. I'm sure it stings on some level or is annoyance, but it is funny that you've probably gotten almost everything you could out of the game at that point, and now the Hellscape exists to give it some level of longevity where the odds are no longer in your favor. Like, I think if StarCraft, if you play that on the highest difficulty, the computer literally cheats. And it's like, it's meant to be as unforgiving as possible, and balance isn't in question anymore. Now it's just, if you throw yourself against the hardest version of this, can you do it? And it's funny that someone would not view it that way, that you as a developer would have completely from the ground up rebalanced your game 3 separate times to have easy, normal, hard. Like,
I didn't even test the game on Hellscape. I just basically pull the sliders up and say, this is on you. Like,
that's funny.
People say, have you finished the game? You're like, no way, I'm not interested. It's not. I made the game, and like a lot of people kind of say, don't even add difficulty things, but then you're always going to get complaints. So you kind of try to put as many options in place. But again, damned if you do, damned if you don't. There's always going to be. You just have to kind of accept that there's always going to be those outlier who will, even the best games on Steam have a couple of unreasonable reviews.
Pretty well always,
But, fantastic game, not for me. Bam, thumbs down.
I couldn't have just quietly refunded and said nothing. Like,
that's right. It's ridiculous,
It's a weird. I've been seeing that for years now, and there is no solution to it. People are just kind of difficult sometimes.
That's right. At least draw a reaction from people, other than the worst thing again is the indifference when no one would care enough.
Did you feel pressured, or did you explore at all adding difficulty to Gorgon Shield, or you maybe decided early on? Because I assume a lot of the decisions there were informed by a fear of scope creep, because you clearly went off a big project. I want this one to be quick.
I actually did have no, I think, am I forgetting this? But
we did add difficulty, because now there's the tower where you can do the sliders. Yeah, there is. So it's not a preset difficulty, but
so we did end up doing that, and for that exact same reason, where people are going to say it's too hard or too easy. So in the end, that was the right thing to do, because the game actually does have an inbuilt difficulty progression through the tower, where the monster stats get slightly better and the spawn rate gets slightly faster and so on. But then even with that, there's going to be players that are, it's too hard for them or it's too easy. So being able to just have that, it's a perfect game for being able to adjust sliders, because you should be able to craft that to your own experience. And in the end, I think that was just the right thing to do, because it almost offsets the game too hard or game too easy, because you can just say, hey, turn the sliders up, turn the sliders down. It's your game. That was actually, you asked about sort of things that were, challenging or a problem or whatever. That was the one thing that I still not sure that I've quite solved, is that when your characters are really powerful, how do you make the very early part of the game interesting? And I don't know if you can. It almost becomes like an idle game where you can set them up, you can go get a coffee, and then except for so manually,
Which is funny, because I can shoulder a little bit of blame here, because really, really early on, when I first was playing the game and getting involved, you had a system in place to spend gold to skip higher up the tower, and I was like, well,
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
when the game gets less floors, add things like the loot system and stuff, the solution is maybe just to make sure those early floors are interesting. But then the funny thing is that there is a point where you just are too good at the game and too powerful, and you trivialize those early floors, and then all of a sudden paying to jump ahead feels like a good solution once again, almost.
Yeah. So it might be that if we find some feedback like that, it might be, you know, just worth putting that back in or something, you know, as an option. Because but then it becomes like sort of like, at one point does it sort of just go, well, you just have unlocked every floor to level 60, and then you can start at level 60 and then win the game, like, you know.
And it's a point of feedback that will almost entirely only apply to people who have already put a good chunk of hours into the game, so that that day one where people are playing around with it, getting a feel for things, have a couple hours in, I don't think they're going to push up against that anyways.
Yeah, I agree.
And so it can be more of a longer term kind of feel out what the feelings are around that, I guess, from the player base.
Yeah, totally. No, I think that'll be interesting to see what the feedback on that is, because that was the one thing where I'm still not sure of, because it's sort of like I just don't know quite how to, you know, unless you're sort of going, if you have 4 heroes in this level, instantly put the difficulty up a bit, you know, for them. But then it's sort of like, yeah, it's hard.
Because really, as a solo developer, I think almost no matter how much play testing, even if you were able to do a big public event on Steam, get 100 people in there and playing around with it, like, it's still not enough. Like, the playtesting required for your average game is unreal.
Yeah. And then the first day your game launches, someone that has never played the game before will load it up and said, oh, it doesn't work. I'm using some computer that you never even thought of. Of course, you know.
Oh, my heart bleeds for Brad right now, because he cracked super fancy pants back open to do some kind of patchwork on it. A few things have kind of started to degrade over time. And he said he ended up having to recode like an enormous chunk of the game because it's falling apart a little bit over time, which is...
It's hard, yeah, and that was definitely one of the problems with Air and Flash and styling and so on, is that it's a skeleton crew working on that, and so there are things that, you know, when they go wrong, you're like, oh man, it's hard to fix.
I hope that... sometime along your next few years of development with Lair the Leviathan, if you ever do need a break, that you go back to the idea of making the sort of game that takes 3 to 6 months to develop, people play it in 10-minute chunks, because it would be really cool if from day one that was what your mission was, the game you intended to make, like what sort of really lock into that Flash mindset and just jam something out.
Absolutely. And like my eldest boy Isaac is, you know, 6.5 and really interested in games, and he just watches me making games and so on. And he's got like lots of ideas for, you know, games, and so I think that might be fun to do. We build the game together, you know, without, you know, worrying too much about, you know, commercial interest and so on. But then, you know, you can just build something that is literally just that sort of 3 to 6 month project that is fun. And, you know, I've got a few ideas already for that, but it's just about finding that sort of balance, you know, not spreading yourself too thinly, but also not burning out on a project that takes 4 years.
Oh goodness, yeah. It's funny, it makes me think of Nick Pasto, Bomb Tunes. He did like Chibi Night and then Super Chibi Night, and that was he made that one with his daughter. She voices the character. Cool. I think she helped with a lot of the enemy designs, and
that's really cute.
Yeah, so like all these years later, that game is a nice little snapshot of her childhood. And they have the shared project. So if you ever were able to do something directly with Isaac, that'd be very sweet.
Definitely, and I think there will be long parts, you know, points in this development of this new game where I'm like, you know, craving making that simple project. And a lot of developers get that, where they sort of like, they get, you know, really deep in the woods and they just miss making something else. And sometimes they'll abandon a big project because they're sort of, you know, it's no longer fun anymore. So it's that balance between sort of staying the course, but also, you know, keeping yourself refreshed.
Oh god, yeah. Luckily with Leviathan, you have someone. I don't know. There's the mutual.
To someone else as well. Yeah, that's a good thing. You're not just doing it for yourself anymore.
I think what are we? We're pushing 2 hours. Pushing 2 hours.
Yeah,
that's probably.
Good chat.
I'm hoping to whittle it down into like a 15-minute video sort of thing, where it's really just like the core. Here's how it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I don't know. I'm curious if there's any other things about the progression of this specific development, ideas, how it evolved, or just how you're feeling about it now that you feel maybe you haven't shared yet.
Yeah, no, the one thing that I actually talked a little bit stream yesterday, and that's up on the stream now. But I always remember the time building Gorgon Shield because probably the most sort of disruptive year of my life personally, and the game itself, in some ways, the journey of that kind of reflects on this, and it's almost a metaphor, kind of like, just surviving and coming together to get something done in a hard time. And I'm really proud of the end result. It's something that really reminds me of my days in the darkened arcades of my youth, and however it does is sort of is in the hands of the gods now. But I'll always have if not a fond memory of building this, definitely a powerful memory of build, and something I'm immensely proud of. So yeah, and it's been really good working with you and your invaluable feedback and support on building the game. It's just been, I wouldn't have been able to get to this point without your help.
Oh, I appreciate it. I hope that's the case, and
it's been fantastic, honestly. No, it's been really, really wonderful. You've been a great motivator and supporter.
Your optimism through it all is really inspiring. It is. I only understand at the surface level what a challenge the year and last few months have been, and the fact that in this relatively short scale you're already able to feel good about the game, have a sense of pride about it, and to relate it to your own life and experience, even without the distance from it, is really impressive, and I think speaks volumes to the positive vibes that you generally bring. So
thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely been dark moments where I'm like, this game is really like, it does feel like I'm stuck in a tower. Like so but actually the happiest, the best moment of building this game was you can probably I think some of the cheats, so you can probably find your way to the end, but the end game animation, without spoiling it for people, is when the heroes defeat Medusa. This really heroic music plays, and you get sort of a longer version of like the arcade scene thing. Just coding that and then replaying it just felt so satisfying, because it was just something like, you're done. Because it was the last thing I really did was that end game sequence and so on, other than some bug fixing. But doing that and then beating Medusa and then seeing the end game play this is good. This is a good feeling.
What a fitting cap to development to actually end with the final sequence of the game. That's really nice.
Yeah, didn't plan that, but I kind of did anyway. But like,
right,
it was natural. Yeah, but it was really nice. It was a really good feeling. A lot of developers probably have that as well when you're doing, the end credits or whatever it is. You really feel like you're, at the end of the journey. Way.
I don't know if you remember Hypnosis. He did like Alice is Dead.
I don't think I ever played it. I know the name, but I never played it.
His approach is really funny because he consistently he makes the start and the end of the game, and then he, if the project fell apart and he never did anything else, because he makes really story heavy games, so it doesn't work with everything.
But he knows that there's always an end point.
Yeah, and so if at some point everything falls off the rails, he's like, well, there's still a game. I can pencil in some in between stuff really quickly. But he always does that, and then he fills in the middle as much as he has the budget and time to do.
That's really smart. It's a great way of doing it.
I thought it was a funny.
Learn from that.
I feel like that we're wrapping up the conversation, but this came to mind, and I don't even know if how on topic it feels, but I feel like it's such a common thing, especially in the indie space, for people to take a lot of their personal experience, a lot of trauma, dark days, things like that, and explore that through the medium of game development and kind of share that. But your games are very lighthearted and these fantasies and wish fulfillment, adventure-y sort of things. And is it an active decision at all to be like, well, this is my personal and this is my job, or
I want it's a great question. I think it is very much for me like escapism, and I do like sort of like and I always gravitate to sort of heroic fantasy and stuff like that. It's not a conscious decision, but I just don't think I think I'm very open and honest when I would talk and share things where I can, but I don't do very well at putting that into a game format because I've never found it as a medium to be that. I'm not successful at doing that. Not that I've ever really tried. I haven't ever really been able to translate my own experiences into sort of a game format in the same way that, you know, people can make games about really sort of, you know, dark experiences and challenging times and really reflects on, you know, this game is about, you know, I've never been able to do that. And yeah, and I kind of I find that a really it's you either go one way or the other, where you put everything in and it's a deeply personal game, or it's like you'd never know anything, you know, challenging was going on behind this, which is I tend to lean towards that way.
I think I relate to that, especially the part of having never tried it, because I feel the same. I think having never done that, if someone tasked me with interpreting struggles of my life and communicating that into a way that is entertaining and you know, I don't think I have it in me. I don't think I have the insight needed to unpack my own.
It's exactly that. I just do not know where you would start and how to make that a fun game. You know what I mean? So
yeah. No, that was just a random.
Yeah, that's a really good question,
because
I think about that a lot of the time. You know, I think you see a lot of these games that are, you know, emotional, and they kind of go, "Oh yeah, that's interesting," but yeah, not something I would ever do.
Isn't there's like a triangle of indie games where it's either it's a game about depression, it's a roguelike, or it's I forget what the other corner of the triangle is, but
totally, yeah, you see them everywhere, right? Yeah, depression quest or whatever, you know.
Yeah. See, you've landed in the other corner. That's
yeah, the other corner. Yeah, just can't teach an old dog new tricks.
Well, really, hopefully, I'll have a version of this spun around prior to the game's release. I'm gonna try, and don't stress if you don't. You know, like it'll be really interesting to see. You know, it was about 6 days time, I think, that the game comes out.
Yeah, I'm gonna do a few little like just a few more GIFs and sort of promotional images in the next couple of days that's leading up, just to put around as well. So, and you know, then fingers crossed and see how we go.
Yeah. I think I saw that that bump had happened yesterday, and I was like, oh great, I specifically made a tweet that was along the lines of like, we're trying to cross this milestone. And then I looked at the tweet and it was like, only 300 people saw it or something, so I don't think that
yeah, I know, right? It's so hard. And you know what it is? It's sort of like, I was talking to my wife about this. It's sort of like, there are some games that just market themselves and just steamroll and so on. And there's others that are just an uphill battle the whole time. And this has really felt like that in terms of just, I applied for like 20 different festivals, nothing. And it's just sort of just felt like, and partly it's just that, you know, it's very hard to explain what this is in screenshots and so on. That's been from the very beginning. The biggest thing for me was like, people either get it or they don't, and if they don't, always going to be a challenge. And I sort of would never hold sort of anyone else accountable for, you know, the challenge of marketing something like this, because you either get it or you don't. You know what I mean? And
ahead of its time, I think they'll say.
Yeah, and you know, hey, look, we got to 5,000, so that might be, you know, maybe hopefully enough to be popular upcoming. If not, you know, could be a long tail. Who knows? So I'll be curious to see.
Yeah, here's hoping. We'll keep pushing that boulder up the hill together, and hopefully we can generate a little
exactly what it is. You know, the Greek analogy, the Greek mythology of
right. I wasn't even thinking at the time, but
yeah.
The last 2 days, I've been sending keys out to as many YouTubers and things as I can. So hopefully a few of them.
You know, never know, that can, all it takes sometimes is one or two good videos. I get so many spam. I've just been deleting them just like
Oh,
from
yeah.
obvious kind of like key hunters, you know.
I could tell you right now that at best, 1/30th of those are legit. Like,
Yeah, absolutely. And in the past, I've fallen for it, but these days I'm like, no. If you're interested, you can buy it. You know, if you really are a legitimate streamer, you'll, you know, either get a key from us legitimate or like, you know, because you can just tell they've just copy and pasted your game, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I've been
yeah,
someday I hope to make a little bit of a 3-minute video that just breaks that down for people, because I don't think a lot of developers understand what the simple tricks are that they're manipulating you a little bit.
Oh, man, and definitely, certainly with newer developers, you know, that excitement of like, hey, someone's interested, I can definitely send it. And you know, with even as recently as Sword and Sandals Immortals, I was given that key. You know, they're almost all resellers.
Ah, damn. Yeah.
Yes.
that market is so. If you've ever taken part in a bundle or what have you, then all of a sudden you'll never track keys again, and it's just gone,
shady, right?
Gone to the wind.
Yeah, it's you gotta move on. Yeah, but it's been a good chat today, and been good to catch up as well.
Yeah, thank you for giving up some of your morning for me here. And
it's fine. Yeah. It's been good, and I think we needed to do it just to get everything. And I think hopefully, between the video and everything, we have at least a technically successful launch in terms of there should be no issues for people running it and everything. And I'll be trying to patch it where I can and just keep on top of things over the launch window.
I'll probably be doing some more runs leading up to and just playing around with things, footage, all that. And if I encounter anything, cool. I'll let you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I can patch it very quickly if needs to.
Yeah, great.
Cool. Well, all right, mate. Well, enjoy the rest of your... What time is it there?
7:30.
Oh, okay. Well, you can go have some dinner or something.
Yeah. I just kind of rearranged my day a little. It was the joys of working for yourself.
Don't you love it? That's exactly it. No one's saying get back to work, because this is work.
Yeah. All right.
All right, mate. I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, take it easy.
Okay, buddy. See ya.